said that he had PTSD, but back then it wasn't really diagnosed. It was probably just battle fatigue or whatever from there. My mother passed away when I was about 10 years old from breast cancer, and my father passed away when I was 11. So I was living with relatives, and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunities. I was in Catholic school. I went to Catholic school my entire life. So I knew that when I was graduating from high school, the odds are I wasn't going to have anyone that was going to help me pay for college. So that was my primary reason, was to join the Air Force, to basically have some sense of security. I always wanted to travel, and I wanted to get my education. So I joined when I was 17. I actually had my guardian sign for me to join from there. And
what year was that?
1979.
79.
Right. And the recruiter was pushing me towards electronics. They said that this field had just opened up for women, and that, you know, was really going to be something that was going to pay off in the long run, and for me to go in open electronics. And so I gave it a shot. I scored high enough on the ASVAB, and so he was like, well, you know, that's really great. Not very many women qualify for electronics. Wasn't real sure how I did, because I went to an all-girl Catholic high school. I had no clue about this, but evidently I showed the aptitude. So I came in open electronics, and my field was basically, the long title was Precision Imagery and Audiovisual Media Maintenance Specialist. So that's a mouthful in that aspect. But basically we repaired both still photography, motion picture equipment, and all of the support equipment, like the photo lab equipment, the lights, the photo processors back then when you had chem mix for film and that kind of stuff like that. We were the individuals that actually fixed that. When I went to tech school, I found the entire time I was in technical school, I was the only female in the building. That was a little odd. And then when I was getting towards the point where I was graduating from tech school, another female came into, you know, the school. She was just starting, so she was a couple of months behind us.
Was that the basic training when you first started?
No, this was basic training was normal basic training. Although it was different, because this was also in 1979. Maybe it started in 78, but in 79, this was the time when men could now be in charge of female flights. So the drill instructor that we had, training instructor, we called him in the Air Force, TI, we were his first female flight. So even in itself, with that, was pretty unique, because he wasn't real sure how to handle women. And when I mean handle women, it's like, you used to keep these demerit slips in your pocket, and, you know, normally the training instructor would just go up to a guy and just rip one out of his pocket. But now he had a female flight, so he had to change his verbiage to give me a 341 as opposed to just taking a 341 from you. So that in itself was pretty interesting from there. And it was you know, he freely admitted that it was a new experience for him. And most of us appreciated it. And as his first female flight, I can recall when we graduated, we all put our basic training pictures under his desk so that he would have something to remember us by from there as well. So it's interesting how those things come back to you, you know, hate to say it, 30 some odd years ago. So it's, you know, 31 years ago now from there, or next month it will be.
Do you remember his name?
No. That part I don't. I really don't remember his name. I guess no, I don't want you to put a gun in my head, but in any event, I probably could. But like I was saying, in tech school, after we finished that, the person that I met, the female that came along later on, wound up being a good friend of mine, and we're still Facebook friends now, even though I haven't seen her in probably a good 15 years or so. But because of that shared experience of going through this all male or primarily male dominated career field, we kind of bonded and kept in contact with each other, even though we were at different assignments. So that was that. My first duty station, again, the first female that they had that ever worked in maintenance for them. Interesting, it was at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. I wasn't too thrilled about that, because I joined the Air Force to travel, as I said earlier. I went to tech school at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and then got a bus ticket to go down to Peterson, like 30 miles or 60 miles down the road. So, but eventually I did get an assignment to go out to Southern California, and that's where I kind of spent a lot of my Air Force career. And I retrained out of camera maintenance because it was being phased out, and I went into public affairs. And I really enjoyed that job. It gave me a great opportunity to really travel without necessarily doing permanent change of stations, because we would go around and do news stories, and I would fly around with air crews all along the Pacific, which they used to call the Milk Run, because they dropped off the Stars and Stripes newspaper and they dropped off the Similac to all these bases across the Pacific. So I got a chance to go to Hawaii, Japan, Guam, the Philippines, and all these other locations from there. And that was pretty neat.
Which base in California?
Norton Air Force
Norton.
Base, right. So, and that was in San Bernardino, California, and it's since closed. So I seem to have had the knack of going to bases that were closing. From public affairs in 1989, I actually went into recruiting, and that was a job that I felt was going to be a natural fit, because I really liked introducing individuals into the Air Force, because the Air Force was something I believed in. I felt as though the Air Force had given me, people join for different reasons, and my reasons obviously were not all that unique from anyone else's, but I think in some ways it may have been by losing both parents at a very young age and not having a lot of choices, in regards to that, and nor having a lot of different exposure to things that after I joined the military, I found out, wow, I could have done this, I could have done that, but I really didn't know about ROTC and all the rest of that from there, especially going to an all-girls school. So I wanted to go into recruiting and able to afford other people that opportunity. And my first duty location was, again, it was Norton Air Force Base in California. So I got to go exactly back to where I was coming from. So that was kind of neat, recruiting in Southern California. And I also recruited up in Victorville, California, near George Air Force Base. I was married at that point in time. My now ex-husband, but he was also in the Air Force from there. And so we were a dual military couple from that standpoint. And recruiting was a lucrative career for me. I did extremely well. I got promoted several times in recruiting. And I went from Southern California to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, which was like the first time I was ever close to home. In all the years that I was in the military, I still maintained a relationship with my cousins and relatives along those lines, and they would come out and visit me in California, but I had never been close out on the East Coast. So McGuire, I was there as what we call an in-service recruiter, and that person helps individuals that are getting off active duty transition into the Air Force Reserve if that's what they choose to do. That position afforded me the opportunity to become Recruiter of the Year. And so I was the top recruiter for the Air Force and the Reserve program for that for, I think it was 1984 or so. And that was great. That was a great opportunity. You have your picture at Maxwell Air Force Base and the Air Museum down there and stuff. So that was kind of neat. Yeah. And after that, I got promoted to E8, and I became an assistant chief of recruiting with that. And from that, I moved to Charleston Air Force Base, South Carolina. And that was not one of my favorite assignments. I mean, it's a beautiful city, but the base, the bugs, all of that kind of stuff, I really didn't care for that too much. But when I was at McGuire, one of the things I forgot to say that was kind of unique with that is that we also were in charge of the European region. And with that, I was the trainer and the supervisor of recruiters that we had over in Italy, at Aviano Air Base. We had a recruiter at Mildenhall and Lakenheath over in England, and we also had a recruiter at Ramstein in Germany. So there again, the Air Force afforded me an opportunity to travel to those sites and to train those individuals. And it was a unique opportunity for them too, because they were all there at a sense of independence. So they really appreciated, like in one time, the recruiter had just gotten there and it was around the holidays, and they were kind of feeling a little homesick on their own. Plus they really didn't know the job real well at that point. So I scheduled a trip to go, during the holidays, and spent Christmas over there with, ate at the dining hall, and what I mean? It was something, I didn't realize the impact of my visit, to that person at that particular point in time until years, maybe like 2-3 years later, they told me how much they really did appreciate having someone come over and take the time to kind of show them the ropes and stay for the holidays, because I had a family myself, but the person clearly wasn't adjusting right off the bat, and so they kind of needed that. So that kind of always makes you have a sense of satisfaction.
You still stay in contact with?
Absolutely. I became his mentor, and I got to tell you, he's retired from the military now, lives in another state, but I'm still, I found it odd that as I moved up the food chain in the military, I supervised a lot of males because, needless to say, that the Air Force is still, like most of the military, still a male-dominated. But they couldn't quite want to explain to folks that I was their boss. So they called me mom or anything but, And even in the Air Force, I did finally not finally, I got promoted to Chief Master Sergeant, which is an E9 when I had 18 years in, which is pretty phenomenal from that standpoint from there. I mean, I didn't realize the impact of it, but I knew that the whole time I worked in recruiting that it was very important, not only there's a sense of responsibility that you have to carry yourself in a certain way. And I found that when I first came in the military and carried that all the way through, that in a lot of ways you are a role model. Going into the electronics field, there was very few women in there. I can't say that I ever really encountered any real overt resistance to having a female work in there, but there was things I knew I had to carry my weight because there was, eyes, because now we're letting women into this, and we wanted to say, could she really lift that toolbox? Could she really, climb up in there? And I mean, they would do challenging things to me, like, you're in maintenance, so maintenance means everything. You got to fix the lawnmower. Okay, I don't know how that fits into a camera, but maintenance, so yeah, I'll do this. I mean, you could easily work on this lawnmower, but you don't want to do this. You want the maintenance folks, so I'll do my part. But it was the same in recruiting, because recruiters often don't get the nicest reputation. But I think that when you operate under integrity and you operate with a sense of honesty and loyalty or belief in what the product is that you're selling, which is the Air Force and the Air Force Reserve programs, it flows naturally from you from there. And I knew that especially if you make it to the rank of chief, people are looking up to you. And the last thing you could do is seal the deal for anybody else that's coming up behind you. So it's important that you present yourself in a professional manner. And that was basically it. So I found I had a lot of individuals that were looking for somebody that they could talk to, that they would know that it would be a sense of, same thing in recruiting, a sense of confidentiality, and someone that would be a mentor to them from there. And I am honored to say that, I did develop a lot of great relationships that still exist beyond my retirement date from there. So since retiring, I retired in March of 2005, and I followed one of my other desires, which was, and I'm going back a little bit, I am happy to say the Air Force did do great by me as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I used the tuition assistance program to get, 2 associate's degrees, a bachelor's degree, and a master's degree before I retired. So, and I had seen pretty much most of the world that I wanted to see from there. So for myself, it was a tremendous experience. And then when I retired, I decided I wanted to go into the mental health field, and I wanted to become a therapist. And so I went back and I got another master's in mental health counseling, and then I got a postmaster's degree, an EDS degree in marriage and family therapy. And the VA, I felt, was a great extension of that in terms of leaving the service and coming back to work with individuals that basically look like you, same shared stories, things that you can have in common from there. So I went to work with them first as an intern with the Vet Center, and I got to hear some tremendous stories of veterans that had went through some unspeakable horrors of war and combat. I was fortunate that I never had to experience that firsthand. I traveled and saw the world, but I was in recruiting for 16 years. So I really, I've been to places where people would deploy. I've stopped by, tent cities and things like that, but I was there for a visit and then moving on to someplace else. I was there to film an AFN commercial or something like that, but not really stationed there. So I was very fortunate. But when I've heard those stories, that changed my perspective and I think made me a much better counselor and a better human being by understanding what others have gone through in the military. And I think far too often we don't necessarily know. We know the new vets that are coming back, but those that have carried that duffel bag of burdens for the past 30, 40 years, it's an honor to work at a vet center and to have someone share that story with you. But I left there to become a voc rehab counselor because, again, I think of it in terms of recruiting, helping people find their niche in life. And I believe that once you have the right career, things tend to go better in your life throughout. You know, a lot of times it's a baseline. If you can have, you know, a job and a sense of security at that particular job, or better still a career, then usually you can work out other issues from that standpoint, you know. But if you don't have the basic security, it makes it difficult. Then I parlayed that, I know all these different jobs, I parlayed that into the job I have now, which is a tremendous job. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to, with the Veterans Employment Coordinator Service with the VA, we try to help veterans get hired by the VA workforce. So I work with a lot of people, again, that are coming off active duty, that are not familiar with the federal process, the federal hiring process, how to convey their military skill set into what we like to call civilianese, in which they learn not to say that I was a first sergeant, but maybe to say that I was a program manager, and I help them bridge the gap to understand how this is really what the job is that you did. In the military, we may call this, but you're not going to find any federal agency that looks for somebody called a first sergeant. So that, again, is an extremely rewarding job from there, and I feel deeply honored to have the ability to still connect with veterans and those that are still on active duty in such a personal manner, and really help guide them through the process of leaving the service and landing on your feet, you know, in the civilian sector, because that's important, that transitional purpose. And I think it makes it a lot easier when you're leaving. You hear so many people that are reluctant to get out of the military because it's the fear of the unknown. And to explain to them that, you know, it's okay if we've never been on an interview or we've never written a resume before, because, you know, I tell them, if you're like me, I was a kid that came in at 17. I never had to write a resume. I never had to go on an interview other than before a board or whatever from that standpoint. So it's a natural process when it's somebody that's gone through it that can come back and share the story and maybe make the path a little bit easier.
Sure.
So that's my story.
I'm curious, well, you skipped past some very interesting places you had an interesting
Okay.
life, but if you go back to when you were 17, first going in as
Right.
a young lady with really no...
Family foundation, right.
Well, yeah, I guess you probably had a family foundation, but not the typical one.
Right,
But
absolutely.
certainly for different reasons. How did you find being a young woman in the Air Force early on when you were first there? Was it...
Well, you know, especially going to an all-girl Catholic high school, I got to tell you, the first, you know, a couple of assignments I had, I just, you know, I found that guys could be really, you know, we used to have to establish rules you never thought you'd ever have to establish, like there will be no passing gas in the shop, there'll be no spitting in garbage cans, because, you know, when you work on cameras, you know, you have intricate parts. And don't ask me why, but it would be things like if a little E-clamp popped off of a camera, you'd have to go searching for it, and sometimes it would flip in the trash. And, you know, and then you go digging in your trash, and then there were guys that chewed tobacco or whatever, and they didn't care. So they would, you know, in the trash can, and you're like, oh God, I am not looking for this little tiny part in here with this guy's mucky muck. So that was... and it's, again, most of the time, most of my assignments, I was the only female in the shop. So you didn't want to necessarily be one of the guys, but you definitely didn't want to stand out for any reason. So, you know, you pushed yourself a little bit harder than you probably would in normal circumstances. You know, you tried to lift things that they would clearly get two people to lift, but because you're the female, you know, you're like, I'm not going to ask you. I don't care what it is. I will struggle. I will lift this. I will do what I've got to do. So, but... yeah, that was quite different, quite the culture shock from.
Did you live on base?
I lived in the dorms. I lived in the dorms for the first 4 years before I got married, And most of the time, yeah, I always lived in the dorm. And that was one of the things I would say about the Air Force, is that we always really had great dormitories, great facilities from that standpoint. The first base that I was at, Peterson Air Force Base, the dorms were really, really nice. I mean, for the most part, you can always manipulate the system to try to get a room to yourself, because they weren't offering rent money to move off base, but people were always willing to move off base. So you tell somebody, I'll be your paper roommate, and they would be your roommate on paper, and you would do their what we call bay orderly, where you had to clean the dorm. It was a rotating schedule, but you had a room to yourself, and it was never any more than 2 people in a room. So that was a great thing. And now in the Air Force, it's actually 1 person per room for the most part after you get out of technical school. So they've come a long way, but it was still.
Was it co-ed in the building? Like, obviously
yes.
Not in the room, but.
It was co-ed in the building, because you had a bathroom in your actual dorm room. And so we're talking about from probably 1980, that was the beginning of the co-ed dorms, when I got to my first duty location. So there would be a guy right next door to you or right across the hall from you, but there was no open bay bathrooms at this particular base at Peterson. So, it was fine. It was no big deal at all. No
social
real
activity
issues.
on a base was there? I mean, were there enough women there to feel comfortable that you were with?
Absolutely, because our dorm initially had been an all-women's dorm, and then it integrated into a co-ed dorm from that standpoint. But you're right, there was still a lot of women in that were in like veterinarian services, which was where they basically tested water and stuff, and then people used to bring their pets. The nurses, not nurses, but med techs, dental techs, security forces. All of us were in one building, regardless of our jobs. So that created a lot of camaraderie. But then, as they integrated it, it still was a good network. I didn't know how to drive till I was like, being from New York, almost, I would say a good 19 going on 20. And the base was a good support system from that. There was always colleges on base, so you can always go to school if you wanted to go to school. And it usually was good transportation in terms of a bus would come by if you wanted to take the bus to the mall or something like that from there. And then, obviously, you always had friends that, had cars or whatever that could take you. But back then, I think the base was a great sense of support. There was a lot to do. You weren't necessarily just bored with idle time. So. But it was up to the individual.
We often ask questions about how did the military affect you and your life after the military, but it feels a bit like you had a transition, obviously, that kept you in touch with the military even after it. So
absolutely.
But there must have been aspects of what you learned in the military that helped you with your career then. I would
definitely say that, transitioning out, I had a lot of apprehension about finding a job. I mean, that was like drilled in your head that when you get out, you got to have a job. And so I rushed out kind of while I was on terminal leave. I started work. The day I started, terminal leave, I went to work for the Army Corps of Engineers. And that was actually, for me, it wasn't the right move. I really should have taken some time off and kind of depressured and, got a feel for myself. It adversely aggravated my disabilities from that standpoint, because I am a disabled veteran, service-connected from that standpoint. But I found it was a different transition because, being a chief in the Air Force, you have your own office, you have your own, all of this world of your own. But there, you're sitting in a little bitty cubicle. You have to align yourself with taking a 15-minute break and scurrying up to get a bagel or whatever, and then scurrying back down and be at your seat at exactly the 15 minutes. And that's very difficult for anybody that's been in the military. I tell them, it's a readjustment issue. And that's the part that I could appreciate about going on it and going into therapy, where you can convey it back to other people that are transitioning. Don't be surprised when this happens to you. And if you feel anxiety as a result of it, like, is it me or is it them? Well, it is them, but they're not going to change. So we have to change and we have to adapt to them because they are the dominant culture. So when you could say that to individuals, and then it, when it does come up, I would hope down the road, they can appreciate that they've heard it before and they understand that, it is going to be a bit weird, but we get through it and we definitely make the best of it and we can land on our feet. from there.
Do you have any interesting stories, individual stories, if you look back? Let's say you had to pick one funny story as an example when you were in the military.
One funny story when I was in the military.
It's a tough question.
Yeah, it is kind of a tough
you're
question.
To share in front
Yeah,
of the
no, not a problem, not a problem in regards to that. Funny story, well, not necessarily even a funny story. One of the great stories that I like to tell is when I took over a recruiting squadron in Southern California. It was the biggest recruiting squadron that recruited for the Air Force Reserve program. It's March Air Force Base in Southern California. And when I had that, I had 21 recruiters. There had never been a female that had ever been in charge of that squadron before. And there was a lot of guys jockeying for that position, and I didn't say a whole lot that I had submitted my application. And there was a lot of shock when I got it. And the place hadn't made goal in several years. So I knew the pressure was going to be on me to deliver because, you know, even though guys had had it for years and crashed the boat, I wasn't going to have that option. So I put a challenge out to the recruiters in which I said to them, if our zone was all of Southern California, Southern Nevada to include Las Vegas, Hawaii, and Guam, and they were all our facilities. So we can go to any one of our facilities, no problem at all. So I said, well, if we make goal, I promise you we'll do a training meeting in Hawaii. And we kicked butt. I mean, we did. I mean, it was unbelievable. I had all kinds of colonels calling me saying, I can't believe you guys did this. You pulled it off. And so we went over there as our for our training meeting, and we took the best picture ever of all of us at Don Ho's or whatever. We took a group picture, and then when I was leaving that base, they actually blew it up on a poster board and gave it to me as a going away present, and said something to the effect of world's best leader. And I got to tell you, that was an honor that never will, you know what I mean, it stuck with me forever. And in my home, I have that hanging up from that, because even though it doesn't match the decor person, but it does, you know what I mean? But it just really, I was so shocked and so moved beyond that. It's unbelievable, but they still talk about that. And that trip was probably 9 years ago, you know, about 8 or 9 years ago. But we had a blast in terms of being able to say that we pulled that off. And when we went and got our award at the recruiting banquet, you know, people just kept saying, how many recruiters are at that location? But it was the biggest, and we did that. So.
I'm just curious, because you seem very motivational in general. Do you do anything with your career experiences in talking to high schools, young people,
well, you
colleges, veterans groups?
Right, the veterans groups, mainly within the VA. I do have an opportunity. I do a lot of career fairs. I do a lot of traveling throughout the Northeast again. So it affords me a lot of times at job fairs and things like that to connect with individuals, and even things like this convention to actually connect with other individuals, and maybe not necessarily get them to come work for the VA, but just to tell them about the Air Force story and how the military in itself can do, you know, tremendous things if you go in there as a focused individual with an objective in mind. Then usually you'll come out achieving your objectives. One of the things that I would just like to say, probably in closing, is, you know, I was in Las Vegas, and it's not necessarily but I happened to have been in a church in Las Vegas, and on the back of a bulletin, there was a quote that I kind of use as my mantra. It says, if you really want to do something, you'll find a way. If not, you'll find an excuse. And I think that when you think of that saying and you apply it to most things in life, it doesn't really have a religious connotation to it. But it's so true that if you really want to do something, you're going to make it happen. Otherwise, you'll say the cost is too high, or it's not worth the effort, or whatever the case may be. But that's how I've tried to live my life with that. And I saw that probably a good 22 years ago. And it stuck with me throughout from there.
Well, in closing, I'd like to thank you personally for your service to our country and
likewise,
service to the vets.
Thank you. And it's an honor to do both. Thank you.
Honorable mention.
Okay.